I want to lead a life that when I'm on my deathbed, I can look back and be really proud of having had a positive impact on people, on the planet.
Tessa Clarke is the co-founder and CEO of OLIO, a free app that tackles the problem of food waste and, in turn, climate change.
We're all wasting food, so we can all take actions to stop. I told a few people about this idea of a neighbour-to-neighbour food sharing app. Almost all of them thought that baby brain had got the better of me. I should get off maternity leave and get back to work. But the businesses to date have felt that they can't help customers stop wasting food in the home until they feel like they can't preach until they've put their own house in order. But the most emotionally difficult times I've had on the OLIO journey, other than fundraising, has been in...
Welcome everybody to the latest in the One Club Redefined series, where we invite game changers and rule breakers to come and share their stories. As Hamza said, my name is Tom Conway-Gordon and I'm delighted to be your host for this evening's talk here at revered Brasserie Langens in the heart of Mayfair. Our venue for this evening's discussion could not be more apt, as this evening's One Club guest has blazed a trail in changing perceptions towards food and our consumption of it. Tessa Clarke is the co-founder and CEO of OLIO, a free app that tackles the problem of food waste and, in turn, climate change. The app aims to connect neighbours and activate communities so that surplus food can be given to others rather than thrown in the food waste bin. Since its conception in 2015, OLIO has grown to more than 120,000 volunteers and 8 million users in 63 countries. OLIO has been recognised by the United Nations as a global sustainability leader and has been awarded Next European Unicorn by Europe's leading tech startup conference, Vivatech. Tessa, welcome to Langens. Great, thank you very much indeed for being here with us this evening.
Be here.
Let's begin at the beginning and set the scene. You grew up on a farm.
I did, a long way away from where we are now.
A long way from this plush velvet room we are in. How was that, and how did it make you the person you are today?
We're going in deep. It was an amazing childhood, but a very difficult childhood. So there was myself and my 2 younger brothers on our parents' farm in the middle of nowhere. So we had a pretty isolated upbringing.
Where was it, the middle of nowhere?
Middle of nowhere, North Yorkshire.
North Yorkshire.
About 20-minute drive to our nearest town.
Okay, the middle of nowhere.
The middle of nowhere, yes. Through that upbringing, I learned about hard work because my parents had no qualms whatsoever with putting us to hard work as kids. I also develops an enormous amount of sort of creativity and problem solving. So when you are working with animals and the weather, and machinery, something is always going wrong, and you've got to learn how to fix it immediately with just the resources that you have available to you right now. And I think that's kind of stood me in pretty good stead for an entrepreneurial career, especially kind of building a business with very little resources. You've got to do what you can with what you've got, and that sort of resourceful mindset I think has worked very well. And then just the resilience, the persistence, the grit, the need to just do the same things day in, day out, have the faith that that will lead to something bigger and better. So I think that sort of childhood set me up well for where I am today, and it gave me a real passion for the environment, the planet, nature. But I certainly had no clue what I wanted to do when I grew up. I knew I didn't want to be a farmer. I didn't want to be a farmer's wife.
Yes.
So as quickly as I could, and I wanted financial independence. We had a very, very frugal upbringing. And so as soon as I could, I kind of left the farm, hot-footed it down to the bright lights and big smoke here in London. I pursued what could be described as a pretty classic corporate career for about 17 years. And then I sort of had a growing entrepreneurial itch, but had no idea what I wanted to do. I was looking for an idea and I couldn't find one. And then a problem came and sort of hit me in the face, which was the problem of food waste. And that's what set myself and my co-founder Sasha off onto this journey with OLIO.
Fantastic. Just a question about the farming. At what age were you sort of put out to work? Were you driving combine harvesters age 7 or
yeah, I mean,
raising
honestly,
pigs age 4? What are you talking about?
As soon as we could carry buckets, we were immediately put to work. I remember the summer very vividly where I think I was sort of 10 years old, and my mum had persuaded my dad that we were going to turn over one field to be organic. And so this was a 9-acre field, and I don't know if any of you know how big 9 acres is, but it's massive. And it being organic meant that we had to sort of weed that whole field by hand with hose. So that was how I spent my summer being 10 years old. So it was definitely sort of a team sport growing up on a farm. Animals have to be fed. You can't sort of take a day off or decide you don't really feel like it. And you have to get outside and work no matter how shitty the weather.
Yes.
And no matter how you're feeling.
Yes, regardless of whether come rain or shine.
Yeah.
And so I suppose that sort of interaction with nature and where food comes from, is that obviously a key part of your insight into that? Doing that as for your childhood in terms of the hard work, the grind, the grit, all that sort of stuff. Did that ever put you off food to a certain extent and the growing process?
No. I mean, I've learned that I'm not a massive fan of having to grow my food myself because I know how hard it is. But because of that, I just got this enormous appreciation for the value of food. Like for me, a carrot isn't just a carrot. It's like, oh my goodness, how many hours, how much labour, how much love went into producing that. So that upbringing always gave me a pathological hatred of food waste. In my family, food waste is pretty much a crime.
Yes.
And I kind of grew up going to pretty extreme lengths to avoid throwing away food.
Sure. So what kind of, you said you had some inklings about being wanting to start your own business and be an entrepreneur. When did that sort of inkling become out of your head and onto paper, as it were, as a sort of plan and you're taking the plunge?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it took far too long. So I want to say there was probably sort of 5 years where I just had this growing desire to do something entrepreneurial. But there were a couple of problems. So as I've already mentioned, I felt I didn't have an idea. I think another problem was I couldn't see any role models that I could identify with. And so I feel really passionately that you can't be what you can't see. But what really kind of ended up pushing me over the edge was I was very fortunate. I was in a pretty senior leadership position in corporate environment and would be sent off on all these leadership training courses, and I would sit in the audience and I'd listen to all these people on the stage telling their stories, and I was so inspired by what they were doing. And then I'd reflect on myself and I think, well, I've got a great CV, but I'm just profoundly uninspired by what I'm doing and what I've done. And I was just reaching a point where I was sick and tired of not being inspired by myself. And I just thought, I really want to be inspired by myself. I want to lead a life that when I'm on my deathbed I can look back and be really proud of having had a positive impact on people, on the planet. And so what then finally gave me the courage and the conviction was actually experience a problem firsthand that was so enormous I couldn't ignore it, and that was the problem of food waste. So I was living and working overseas and moving back to the UK, and on moving day the removal men told me that we had to throw away all of our uneaten food, and obviously the farmer's daughter in me just went, no, I refused to do that. So I stopped packing up my boxes, instead bundled up my newborn baby and toddler at the time, and if anyone's got kids in the audience, you'll know that that's like a 45-minute exercise in and of itself. I went out into the street, clutching this food, hoping to give it to this one person she was always in this spot outside our supermarket, and for some reason she wasn't there that day. I admit that I cried tears of utter frustration that I'd sort of gone to all this effort to try and share this food and I failed. So I went back to my apartment feeling pretty stressed out, but I just could not entertain putting that food in the bin. And so when the removal men were in another room, I sneaked the non-perishable food into the bottom of my packing boxes, and that was the moment when I thought, oh, Tessa, like, you are taking it too far now. You've resorted to cross-border smuggling. This is ridiculous. And at that point in time, I'd spent a decade working in the digital space. I knew there was an app for everything. I couldn't believe there wasn't a simple app where I could advertise my spare food, and anyone who wanted it, who lived nearby, could request it and pop around and pick it up. And I just intuitively knew there's probably someone within 100 metres of me who would like this food. Problem is, they don't know about it, and we can't connect with each other. And so that was the inspiration for OLIO. I told a few people about this idea of a neighbour-to-neighbour food sharing app. Almost all of them thought that baby brain had got the better of me. I should get off maternity leave and get back to work pretty pronto. Office, But luckily, my co-founder, Sasha, her name is Sasha Celestial One, really is her second name.
Pretty cosmic.
It's very cosmic, and it's an indication of the fact that her upbringing was pretty unconventional as well. So her parents were hippie entrepreneurs in the Midwest of the US. So Sasha, when I told her about this idea of connecting neighbours to share food instead of waste food, absolutely loved it and got it. And it was only through having a co-conspirator, I think, that either of us had the confidence to maybe start to take those first baby steps of creating what is today OLIO.
Understood. Let's talk a bit about the early years of the business. What were some of the biggest obstacles you faced as you got OLIO off the ground or out of the ground?
So many. Well, the first obstacle that we had to face was figuring out how on earth to finance building an app. But something that we did even before that, we had deduced that actually leaping straight to building an app was probably a high-risk venture. It was going to cost a lot of money, and in all probability, because there were millions of apps in the App Store, in all probability we would lose all our money building an app that no one wanted. So we thought, how can we figure out whether people are willing to share food with strangers without building an app? And what we settled on was doing a proof of concept using WhatsApp. So we sent out some market research survey, we shared it through all sorts of Facebook groups, and one of the questions that we asked in that market research survey was how people felt when they threw away food. And 1 in 3 people told us they felt physically pained throwing away perfectly good food. And we used that language because we wanted to sort of filter out for, food waste is bad. But wow, 1 in 3 people feel physically pained throwing away perfectly good food. There's been no innovation since the rubbish bin. Fantastic. We're definitely trying to tackle a mainstream problem. But back to that sort of, but how can we figure out if people will actually take the steps it required to share food with a stranger? What we did was we reached out to 12 people who said they were physically pained throwing away perfectly good food. We invited them. They all lived near each other in North London. They didn't know each other. They didn't know us. And we organised this all via email, and we said, we're going to run this crazy experiment for 2 weeks. We're going to pop you on a WhatsApp group, and if anyone's got any spare food, here are some people who might or might not be interested in picking it up. So we launched that experiment. We waited with bated breath for 1 or 2 days. I can't remember. It was an agonising wait. And then eventually the first items were shared. Fast forward to the end of 2 weeks, people said, you've absolutely got to build this. It only needs to be slightly better than a WhatsApp group. And they said, how can I help? And that then became the genesis of, we might cover it later on, our ambassador programme. So we knew then that actually, it was probably a good, not too risky, to invest our savings building this app. So we got an agency in Bristol called SimpleWeb. We did a deal with them whereby they gave us half-price day rates in exchange for an equity stake in the company when we next did our fundraising. So that was access to capital and how on earth we could finance the business. Then the next sort of big challenge that we came across was the fact that in the very early days, our early adopters absolutely hated food waste. They downloaded OLIO in their droves, but because they hated food waste, they didn't actually generate any. So they had no surplus food to give away. And then we had invited a number of local businesses onto the platform, so cafes and coffee shops and stuff like that, in the hope that they would put their unsold food on the app at the end of the day, bring people into the store, cross-sell, upsell, etc. But they didn't put any food on the app either because they were too busy running their day-to-day business. So we were a food sharing app with no food. So that was a very big problem that we had to overcome. And how we did that was we said, well, why don't we take all those people who have lots of time but no food waste, and we'll match them with the businesses that have lots of food waste and no time. And so that was really the kernel that has now today grown into our Food Waste Heroes programme. So we have over 125,000 volunteers who we recruit from our community. We train them on our food safety management system, and once you're a trained volunteer, Food Waste Hero we call them, you can claim a collection slot. And a collection slot is an opportunity to go to your local Tesco or Sainsbury's or Asda, corporate canteen, school or hospital canteen, TV or film production shoot. These are all places where we're collecting and redistributing surplus food. So you go to that location at the allotted time and day, you will pick up all of their unsold or unserved food, you will take it home, you will add it to OLIO. Within minutes your neighbours are requesting that food, and minutes later they're popping round to the volunteer's house to pick that food up. So that was how we solved for the problem of getting surplus food onto the platform, and that was also how we solved for the problem of growing OLIO across thousands of communities across the UK, because as we rolled out store by store, we ignited that sort of flame of hyperlocal sharing in thousands of communities, and then it also helped to solve the problem of generating revenues. So primary business model is charging businesses for the service that we provide to collect and redistribute their surplus food, because at the moment they are paying waste contractors to take that food off to waste streams, and instead they now pay us, and we make sure that food is eaten by people, which is what all food should be eaten by, should happen to all food, and we are then able to give them back their impact data in terms of environmental impact, social impact, user testimonials. They can then use that in their internal marketing, their external marketing, part of their ESG plans.
Can I just to jump in there?
Yeah.
In terms of the early stages, we've seen stories of certain brands refusing to give products away, not necessarily food products, but very luxury
we
brands,
had it with food products.
burning very valuable items of clothing, this sort of stuff. And indeed, companies and cafes and these sort of groups have been reticent to let people, skip divers, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
In the early days, what did you have to do to sort of convince the sort of naysayers about this? No, you can't have our food, it's going in the bin, we don't care whether it's going to feed anyone else. How do you get over that?
honestly, it was really, really hard, and it's still really, really hard. Just to put that into numbers, at the moment, UK businesses throw away 2 billion meals of perfectly good food every single year. And we've got 10 million people who are living in food poverty in this country, of which 4 million are children. So we are so far away from having solved this problem. And this is a conversation we have every day. How we started to unlock this was really, well, one, refusing to give up and or go away.
Determination.
But two, we started super small. So we first piloted the Food Waste Heroes programme with a couple of local corner stores in North London. So got that model working there. Then we worked up to Planet Organic, and that was like super exciting. Wow. The first sort of mainstream brand, and we got one of their stores, and then I think they had another 6 or 7 stores at the time, so we rolled out with Planet Organic.
Was that sorry to jump in, was that a sort of a charm offensive, or
it was an enlightened business, honestly.
Yes,
enlightened business with an enlightened business owner.
Yes, you kind of got it and understood what you were talking about.
Yeah, yes, real leadership. Then from Planet Organic, the next fish we caught was Pret-a-Manger. So that was a major moment for us. And again, that was a business that was already committed to trying to redistribute its food to the homeless and to charities, but there was an enormous amount of food they still couldn't distribute through those channels. And it was only after that, and after about 3.5 years worth of persistent relationship building, we managed to secure Tesco. And that was absolutely game-changing for us, rolling out across 2,700 stores across the UK. Now, you would like to think that once you've got Tesco, everyone else falls into line.
Yes, I was about to say.
Sadly not. It's taken us another 4 years after that to kind of this summer. We've now closed several other very large supermarkets that we've now rolled out with. But it took many years, even after Tesco signed up with us. And I think part of the problem is because food waste takes place behind closed doors. And
as in, no one wants to see that you're throwing out hundreds of thousands of sandwiches or whatever it might be.
Exactly. Customers don't get to see that. The public doesn't really understand the scale with which this is happening, and I think businesses think that they've got more pressing problems to deal with.
Is it a dirty secret when you say food waste, given the conversations you've had with these sort of things?
And
the fact that the hesitancy to...
It's the dark underbelly.
Why is that? Why is it such a
industry.
dirty secret? Why can't people be honest and say, we've got lots of smoked salmon sandwiches, come and help yourself, or whatever it might be, or rows of marrows and that sort of stuff?
So you can't just sort of give away the food randomly, because you have to make sure that that food is redistributed in a way that is safe and at scale. And you have to sort of, and generally businesses want to manage that redistribution away from the store. So I think the industry needed a solution like OLIO's, and it didn't exist for a very long time. Now that we do exist, I honestly think that no one has any excuse to still be throwing away perfectly good food. The thing that we are desperate for is some regulation, which has been in the offings, and the previous government has done U-turns on it multiple times. But essentially there's some regulation that the industry really, really supports, which would mandate that large businesses have to not only measure but publicly report on their food waste data. And we can't wait for that, because it is true that sunlight is the best form of disinfectant. The minute they have to publicly report on their food waste data, they will be galvanised to take action to solve that problem. And yeah, it's very frustrating that that has not happened yet, but we continue to bang the drum vociferously.
Yeah, of course. I mean, what change do you think needs to happen on a societal and perhaps obviously governmental level for that conversation to really, as you said, bring into the light for the change to happen, or the more meaningful?
Everyone has more power than they think they have. So everybody could be asking their local restaurant, cafe, fast food restaurant, supermarket, what happens to your surplus food? And you have to be quite careful. You'll probably then experience something that I call charity washing, which is we redistribute to charity. But if you then ask how many of your locations redistribute to charity, on how many days of the week, what percentage of your food is actually redistributed, and you'll very quickly find that most businesses still have an enormous food waste problem, and they are most likely to respond to problems when customers tell them that this is important to them.
Yes, indeed. Otherwise, they'll go elsewhere, obviously.
Yeah.
Let's dive back into the business again. What has been your biggest failure, and what did it teach you about running a business?
I mean, honestly, I'd say whilst OLIO has been my greatest success, it's also been my greatest failure, because we have not got anywhere near where we need to get to, given
So
the
that's because
size
you
of the
haven't
climate
got.
crisis.
Sorry to cut you. Is that not because you haven't got there yet, or because it hasn't kind of
It's all
morphed
taken
as quickly?
It's all taken far too long. This month we will cumulatively have redistributed 200 million portions of food, which is amazing, and that would have had an environmental impact equivalent to taking over 750 million car miles off the road, and we will have saved 30 billion litres of water. So that's incredible, right? But the problem is that is less than 1% of our full potential, and we can all see what's happening with the climate crisis. There are still millions and millions of people who are struggling to put food on the table in this country. But the reason why I think progress has been so slow is because we've discussed the businesses at quite length. So it's quite clear why they've been so slow to solve the problem of food waste. But we haven't talked about food waste in the home. And actually that's where the vast majority of food waste takes place. So it's very easy to point the fingers at businesses, but actually half of all food waste in the UK takes place in the home, and just 10% takes place at a retail store level or at hospitality and leisure. So the real problem and the biggest failure I think that we've had sort of at OLIO is that we haven't got 28 million households taking 10 seconds to share their spare food on OLIO instead of tossing it in the bin. And the reason why that's been so hard, in addition to just a lack of resources, is because it does require sort of behaviour change, and it does require people to recognise that to take action early enough on their food, and also to recognise that just because they don't want something doesn't mean someone else won't. So a real challenge that we have is something that we sort of call the middle class problem, which is someone will look at a head of broccoli, or they'll look at 4 limes and think, well, I don't want this, so no one will want this. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. So a typical food listing on the app is generally requested within minutes of being added to the app, on average within 20 to 30 minutes.
Someone putting their hand up saying, I'll have those.
I'll have those, so it goes so fast. So we've still got an awful lot of work to do to persuade citizens at scale that giving away their spare food is something that they should do. Once they've done it, by the way, people go, oh my God, that was amazing. It felt incredible to give some food to someone who wants it, or maybe even needs it. It feels great that didn't go to waste. And then people will often share photographs with each other with how they cooked that food and how they ate it and what an impact it made, to their lives. So it's an incredibly fulfilling thing to do. So it's not just about sort of saving the planet. Stopping food waste is the single most powerful thing humanity can do.
Let's get into that a bit more.
Crisis, but it just feels good on a human level.
So you mentioned climate change. How, to the layman, and myself included, before I did some proper research into you and the topics at hand, what's the link between that and the climate change?
So
and the threat of?
It's an enormous direct link, and it is something that most people are not aware of. So globally, we throw away 1/3 of all the food we produce each year, which is
a third,
which is worth over $1 trillion. Alongside that, we have 800 million people who go to bed hungry every night, who could be fed on just 1/4 of the food that we waste in the Western world. And then onto the environmental impact. If it were to be a country, food waste would be the 3rd largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the USA and China. Globally, food waste generates 10% of greenhouse gas emissions, which, to put that into context, is 5 times the emissions of the whole entire aviation industry, and it is larger than the emissions of the whole entire fashion industry. So food waste alone generates more emissions than the whole entire fashion industry.
The biology of that being the fact the food rots and the gas comes off it, the methane?
Well,
when we say food waste, what does that
roughly
really
80% of the greenhouse gas impact of food takes place before it kind of hits your plate. So they are, it's all the fertilizers that are put onto the soil. It's all the energy that goes into planting and then harvesting and then packaging and manufacturing and distributing and chilling and refrigerating and shipping. All of that stuff creates 80% of the emissions. So again, that's another thing to be really careful of. A lot of people say, oh, well, I compost my food, so I'm super eco. Yes, composting your food is better than tossing it in the black bin bag, but it's only marginally better because 80% of the emissions have taken place before it, if not more, have already taken place. So food really needs to be eaten and eaten by human beings. And just to contextualize for you what that means for you kind of in your homes, so the greenhouse gas emissions from 1 kilogram of food waste, so if you imagine a food waste caddy that hopefully you've all got in your kitchens, so the greenhouse gas emissions from 1 kilogram of food waste is equivalent to the greenhouse gas emissions from landfilling 25,000 plastic bottles. So back to that head of broccoli, if you just like chuck a head of broccoli into your compost, you can get around to eating it. That is having an environmental equivalent of you chucking several thousand plastic bottles into landfill. Like, that is how bad food waste is. An apple isn't just an apple. An apple is 100 odd litres of water that went into making that. And food waste is not just about carbon, right? It is, as I've said, about water. It's a water depletion issue. So a quarter of humanity's fresh water is used to grow food that's never eaten. By 2030, humanity's demand for water is going to exceed supply by 40%. It's a carbon issue, it's a water issue, it's then a biodiversity issue because we are ripping up rainforests like it's going out of fashion, destroying species, sending them into extinction, displacing indigenous populations to grow all this food. A landmass larger than China is used every year to grow food that's never eaten. So it is no exaggeration to say that food waste is truly one of the biggest problems facing humanity today. Plus, we've got to feed 10 billion people in a minute. We've got going to have 10 billion people on the planet by 2050, and we don't know how we're going to feed everybody. We have no clue. We need to increase food production by 50%, according to the FAO.
What's the
Plus,
FAO?
the Food and Agriculture Organization, the global UN body. Yes, food waste is a very, very, very big problem. So it's very easy to hear all the statistics and feel overwhelmed and depressed. But then I just remind you
yes, please.
that we're all wasting food. So we can all take actions to stop wasting food, whether it be talking to our employer about what happens to the food at the end of the day with our corporate canteen, through to us taking actions to try and reduce our food waste in our home, or give it away, to friends and family, or maybe use an app called OLIO, and speaking to the businesses where you shop and spend your money.
How much of an issue is, or a concern, or a factor, let's call it, is the best before date?
So dates are a significant issue. My sense is that, having spoken to lots of people about food waste, is that many households have a bitter war about dates. There's generally someone in the household who's very cavalier about dates, and there's someone in the household who, the minute it's past 1 minute past midnight, I will not eat that food, even if it's best before date. So just to be super clear on dates in this country, in the UK, there's 2 types of dates that you will experience on food. There is a use by date, which is a health and safety date. So you technically should not eat food after it's used by date. We do not allow food to be given away on OLIO after it's used by date because it is a health and safety date. But then there's the best before date, and that just means that the food is optimal for consumption before that date. So it's optimal from composition or taste or aesthetics perspective, but food can be safely and deliciously eaten for weeks, months, even years after the best before date. And the best before date is the real problem, because a lot of people, they see a date and they just throw it away, and they don't realise that was only a best before date.
How can people break the rules, as it were, of the best before?
But the best way to think about food is to kind of use your own senses.
Yes, that's what I mean.
So best before dates, really, you've got an enormous amount of leeway there. Used by dates, you do have to be more careful because they are a health and safety date.
What do you like most about being the CEO and co-founder of a clearly impactful app such as OLIO?
Knowing every day that I am working my socks off to try and help solve the climate crisis. So I can't think of any better way to spend my time than sort of standing up and being counted when it comes to tackling what is, at the end of the day, an existential problem for our species. And then the human impact as well, really. So kind of on my good days, I'm really focused on the numbers and the climate crisis, and then on the bad, challenging days, I take real inspiration from the human stories that we get every single day into OLIO about the impact that building friendships has made, that having access to food that people wouldn't have otherwise had access to has made, and sort of quantifying that social impact. Survey, and 40% of our community say they've made friends through OLIO. 2/3 say that sharing has improved their mental health, and 3/4 say that sharing has improved their financial well-being.
Just on that, yeah, I was looking at those stats. I mean, they're fascinating. The 66% about how OLIOs improve their mental health, that's obviously come from connection, being part of a community, interacting with people when they might be
getting outside and walking to pick something up.
Getting some fresh air, some sunlight, as you mentioned earlier. But the 75% of how that's affected their financial, can we dig into that a bit? In what sense? They're giving away this food, they're not being paid for it. So how does that work?
Each year on OLIO, we are giving away over £70 million sterling worth of stuff, predominantly food, but also household items. So that is over £70 million worth of value that is being picked up by people sort of for free. And then most people on the OLIO app are picking stuff up. Some pick stuff up only, and some pick stuff up and give stuff away. There's only actually quite a small percentage of people who only use OLIO to give stuff away.
I see. So you've got some incredible stats here, as you mentioned, running into the millions and 127,000 volunteers and obviously 8 million downloads in 63 markets. How do you data crunch all of this? What sort of insights come out of that? Or do you use AI, for example? How do you capture all of these behaviours and bring them to kind of focus?
Lots of questions there. So I think the thing with data and calculating your impact is it's really important to do it in a stage appropriate way. So honestly, kind of when we first launched OLIO, we didn't know half of this stuff. We just knew how many listings came onto the app and how many of them were requested, and that was it. Then and we just had to focus on getting the flywheel going. We didn't have any spare resource to be calculating any of this stuff. As you start to grow and scale, you say, okay, I can invest a bit more time doing some sampling analysis to calculate this. Then I can grow and scale a bit more. I can spend a bit more time working with the university or doing whatever's required. So with data, I think it is really important to treat it in a stage appropriate way. You touched on AI, so we have sort of fully embraced AI at OLIO, so we've moved sort of fairly quickly on that because we have seen it as a really powerful lever to enable us to be able to decouple growth in impact, growth in the number of listings coming on the app, and headcount growth for the organisation. So what I mean by that is we now use AI to it sort of preemptively scans all of the imagery of the listings that people are putting on the app, and so we can tell people when they're sort of breaking the rules or adding something they shouldn't add. So that then stops a whole load of flag reporting then coming into our customer satisfaction team. So we're using AI kind of a lot around rules, compliance, quality assurance on the platform, and then we've also implemented AI into the core user experience. So when you're adding a listing on OLIO, you can press this button that says AIify, and it will auto-complete the title and the description of that listing for you. And in particular for our volunteers who are adding lots of listings in a very short period of time to get that food redistributed, that's a really, really helpful user feature.
What do the next 5 to 10 years look like for OLIO?
So we're really sort of pegged on 2030, which is now, or soon in a minute, going to be 5 years away. So we've kind of really aligned how we think about things alongside the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And in our dream scenario, by 2030, OLIO is being used all over the world at scale by hundreds of millions of people at any one point in time. And we've really kind of gone a long way towards solving not only the problem of food waste, but also the problem of waste more broadly. We're really motivated to solve waste more broadly, again, for kind of pretty existential reasons. So there's a concept which we came across a few years ago called Earth Overshoot Day. That is the day in the year in which humanity has used all the resources that the Earth can replenish in a year. It was first measured in the early 70s, and back in the early 70s, Earth Overshoot Day was the end of December, which means that humanity used in a year all the resources that the Earth could replenish in a year. So back then we were living in equilibrium with the planet. If you fast forward to this year, Earth Overshoot Day was the 1st of August. And so what that means is that every single thing that every single one of us 8 billion people are consuming after the 1st of August is net depletive to the planet. So it does not take a rocket scientist to figure out that this is profoundly and wildly unsustainable. And so our vision for the future really is one of a world where we have people sharing instead of shopping. We have people borrowing stuff instead of buying brand new, and we really have flipped away from the current model of consumption, which is extremely linear, extremely extractive, extremely impersonal, and whether we like it or not, it cannot continue, to a model which is all about kind of circular living, has the sharing economy truly at the heart of it. And to get there, we're going to have to reinvent sort of what capitalism looks like. We're going to have to reinvent everything about our economies. We're not going to achieve it, sadly, by 2030, but hopefully by 2030 we'll be a lot further along the path than we are now. And at OLIO, we just want to play the role that we can in terms of helping to spread the word about this, but most importantly, give people a really practical, fun, easy-to-use tool. Because in our experience, people get overwhelmed by all this big stuff because it is really depressing and really scary, but actually they feel super empowered and they feel really optimistic when they're given a tool that feels really good to use and it works really well.
If you could go back and do it all again, as it were, what would you, using obviously what you know now, what would you change?
Well, listen, I'm someone, my approach to life is a kind of no regrets type approach. So, and I believe that everything happens for a reason, even the bad stuff. And I wouldn't be here today if we hadn't, but that aside, I think there's two things really. I think Sasha and I spent an awful lot of time, and I'm sure many entrepreneurs in the audience can relate to this, spent an awful lot of time looking for silver bullets, thinking that the next marketing campaign, the next feature, the next client,
Next shiny
toy would unlock Instagram style, ChatGPT style stratospheric growth, and we've now just learned that there sadly is no such thing as a silver bullet. There's just an awful lot of lead bullets. We just got to keep layering them on to one another. I think learning that lesson earlier might have saved us lots of sad nights. And then I think the other thing is, would ideally have realised kind of much earlier. I think we were very idealistic. I think we felt that if we just created this solution to solve this chronic marketplace inefficiency, that if we just put that into the world, people would figure it out. That if we just tell people about all this stuff, then people would just change their behaviour.
Get it. And
what we've realised is human beings just don't work like that. We have to stop being so idealistic. We have to meet people where they are. So as a result, how we talk about OLIO has really changed. We as founders are massively motivated to solve the climate crisis. We could not be more agitated to solve this, but that's not what's going to galvanise people at scale to take action. Unfortunately, what people respond to is what we refer to as kind of selfish altruism, which is kind of what's in it for me. And so instead, we really need to lean on the how good it feels to share, how much money you can save. The businesses, they care more actually about the social impact than the environmental impact. So it's taken us longer probably than it should have done to figure that out and to repackage what we talk about and how we talk about it to unlock the growth that we want.
One of the questions people sitting here and going to be listening to this podcast should be asking themselves about that sort of hurdle, let's call it, for behaviour, or make them more engaged in this serious issue, given some of the stats you mentioned.
Just to check that I understand the question. So
sure. What should people take away from this in terms of their food behaviours? What are the questions? You talked about that sort of changing behaviour at a very ground level. What are the sort of steps that are required?
So I think the single most important thing for people to take away is you have power. It was billions of small actions that caused the climate crisis in the first place, and so by the very same logic, it's billions of small actions that are going to get us out of it. No one else is going to come and save us on there isn't a white knight on a horse that's going to come in and save us. We've got to save ourselves, and it requires every single one of us to get involved. And all of those tiny actions, they all very quickly ladder up. Let's take Instagram or TikTok. Look at how quickly they have grown, they have scaled, they've changed the world. That is through billions of people taking billions of small actions every single day. So just imagine what we can do if we start to apply that, living more sustainably, for example. And I think the really important thing with living more sustainably is a lot of people set up a bar of perfection for themselves.
Talk about that, yes.
I've got to be vegan, I can never fly again, I've got to sort of live in a cardboard box. That just feels so unattainable, everyone gives up. You don't have to be vegan, but maybe you could do meat-free Monday and start off there. Maybe you don't have to entirely give up flying, but perhaps you can say, I'm not going to do, international weekends away. And perhaps I'll only do international weekends away if I catch the train, right? And you start there, and the most important thing is recognize that once you start with baby steps, you get this fantastic kind of virtuous cycle of you kind of get this endorphin hit of like, oh, I did that, I had an impact, it made a difference, and it makes you then more adventurous. And so very quickly snowballs actually, and you do find yourself, just because you want to, becoming more sustainable, just because you started off. And it's the same with entrepreneurship, right? If you look at all these entrepreneurs who are on the stages everywhere talking about stuff. It feels completely unattainable. How do they get there? Just break it down. It's just day in, day out, taking baby steps. And it's the same with sustainable living. It's just like day in, day out, just take another baby step today and you'll make a lot of progress.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Tessa. I'm going to open the floor to any questions. Sir?
You mentioned, great podcast by the way, really enjoyed that. You mentioned that humanity every year wastes a lot of food, and that there's a land mass equivalent of China, which is really, really huge, that all that food does not get consumed. Mm-hmm. So wouldn't it be more sense that all these supermarkets and all these different people stop ordering so much food? Because surely economically that makes no sense while that exists.
So one, we just need to remind ourselves, so here in the UK, supermarkets generate just 2% of all food waste, and we in our homes are 50%, so let's just keep remembering that. If you take supermarkets as an example, actually it makes very sound economic, so one of the areas where they generate most waste is bakery. Now for them, the marginal cost of producing extra loaves of bread is close to zero. The opportunity cost of having empty shelves, and so people don't want to shop in your supermarket anymore, is enormous. So it makes sound business sense for them to ensure that they have fully stocked shelves until the end of the day. And same with sort of wonky sort of fruit and veg. Lots of consumers say, isn't it outrageous that supermarkets have got all these cosmetic standards and the farmers are ploughing in the fields because half the crop doesn't meet the standards? That comes back to us because we left behind that wonky potato and that wonky banana. So again, sort of back to things that you can do. Whenever I'm in a supermarket and I want a banana or some bananas, I'll pick up all those single bananas that by themselves, because I know that no one else is going to take them, and if no one else takes them, they're going to get thrown away. So you have to remember that businesses respond to consumer behaviour. Consumer behaviour is you and me and everyone in this room, etc. But what is exciting is that if we can reduce food waste, redistribute that food, instead of wasting it, then now if the world population stayed the same, then it would mean that we could reduce the amount of food that we produce. But actually we've got a rapidly growing global population that we don't know how we're going to feed, and so the land that we free up through stopping wasting food can be used to grow food to feed all the people who are soon to be joining the planet.
I read that you very much were in support of female founders in particular, and you face particular hurdles yourself. We have quite a lot of female founders in the room happily this evening. I was just wondering if you had any words of advice for them.
Yeah, I am very passionate about the cause of female founders and founders of colour, because the area that frustrates me most is where it comes to fundraising. So just the stats on female founded businesses. Female founded businesses capture just 2% of all venture capital investment each year. Male founded businesses get varies from year to year, between 80 and 85% of all venture capital investment, and mixed teams get the delta. And the same is for founders of colour. They get less than 5% of all venture capital investment. This makes me really angry because I see that, or I believe that biggest problems facing humanity today are going to be fixed by the people who are most impacted by those problems, and the people who are most impacted by those problems are women and people of colour. And so by shortchanging women and people of colour, we are honestly shortchanging humanity. We are messing around, investing obscene sums of money into quick commerce, whilst we are not solving the climate crisis or the social inequality or the healthcare crises that we have. And my belief is that the reason why female founders, for example, are so underinvested in, over a decade, that 2% number has not budged. There's been an awful lot of hand-wringing about it, an awful lot of female founder office hours and female founder mentoring programs, and nothing has changed. And I don't think it's going to change until we have gender representative investment committees. And at the moment, only roughly 10% of investors with check writing capabilities are women. So nothing is going to change for female founders until we change the gatekeepers of capital. Same for people of colour.
Akshay, you got a question?
Yes. Thank you so much for that. That was really, really amazing. I'm incredibly passionate about this problem of food waste. I wanted to just ask, you said it's crucial that all of the foods that's generated is consumed by humans.
Yeah.
There's this company called Mill in the US primarily, that basically what they've built is a dustbin. It looks like a dustbin.
Oh, I've seen it.
Probably you've seen it, but you basically, for consumers at home, they chuck all of the food scraps in it, and it composts it internally, and then the Mill team comes once a month and collects it.
Yeah.
And supported by Bill Gates as well. Mm-hmm. How is that I'm just
So
trying to
I
understand, why
think
is that not a good solution?
because, so that is definitely better
Right.
than putting your food waste into the black bin bag, because when food waste goes off to landfill, it decomposes without access to oxygen, it creates methane, which is over 25 times more deadly than CO2. So putting your food waste into a black bin bag is a really bad thing to do. Putting it into a compost is a much better thing to do. But the problem is that 80 to 90% of the carbon emissions from that food has already taken place. It's already been wasted. The biodiversity impact has already been had. The waste of that water has already been had. So composting is only marginally better than landfill.
Understood. And if, sorry, just to follow up, if it is, so one of the things they do is they take it back and feed it to cattle, feed it to hens and poultry farms. Is that again not a good idea?
So, I mean, again, my view is that food and sort of human grade food had so much happen to it that it really should be eaten by human beings. It's just sort of plain and simple, really. Like, food should not be being burned to generate energy. Human food should not be being eaten by animals. It should all be eaten by human beings. Animals should eat animal food.
So you disagree with taking sort of stale bread to feed the ducks at Kensington Garden?
Oh gosh, don't get the OLIO community onto that one. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the feeding ducks with bread. But all I will say is that white processed bread is not good for human beings. It really ain't good for ducks either.
Fantastic. Any other questions, anyone? Shoot.
Thank you for sharing your childhood story. That was really interesting, and how your upbringing impacted your decisions later on. What kind of lessons would you teach the new generation? Because obviously habits and kind of lifestyle changes, they don't happen quickly, they happen probably generationally in many cases. So what kind of habits would you recommend to instill in the new generation Alpha, or the subsequent ones that are coming up, to help the mission?
Yeah, I get confused with, the names of the different generations, but it's the very youngest generation. I've got 2 kids, they are 10 and 11. On the basis of my experience, the school is doing a really good job of raising their awareness of the climate crisis. I've actually been really impressed with their education, and they are quite sort of agitated to solve it. But at the same time, I see this massive disconnect between what they learn, what they intuitively feel, versus then the minute they go out into the world, where an assault on every single one of their senses and every synapse in them is telling them to buy, generally plastic crap that they don't need, but they sure as heck feel like they want it. And it's the same with sort of the much fabled Gen Z, who all the data shows that they really care about the climate crisis, but they are some of the worst culprits in terms of buying fast fashion and wasting food, for example. So there is, across all generations, there is this kind of really big say-do gap. But the problem is, it is very difficult for individual people to sort of swim against the tide of our society and our culture. And that's why I think we need not just business people trying to inspire people to set up climate-friendly businesses, but we need people from all walks of life to be starting to talk about this and inspire people. And most importantly, a lot of the conversation around the climate crisis at the moment is very doom and gloom laden, and I think there's a real opportunity to inspire the next generation with a vision of the future, which is true, which is that we can all be wealthier, healthier and happier if we live more sustainably. And I think that's the picture that we need to paint to really inspire that younger generation, because otherwise there's a risk that they just collapse into utter despair and anger.
Where do you see the cross-section of like the cost of living right now, with like the younger generation not being able to then afford, or only being able to afford like fast fashion, kind of quick meals, things like that, with the climate crisis and what you're trying to accomplish?
I do sort of, I take to task that sort of only being able to afford fast fashion, because it's like there are thousands of charity stores, there is Vinted, that, actually, I think the problem is that society is blasting at them that this is what success looks like and this is how you should lead your life. I think that's the real challenge. And it's the same with food. I get really frustrated. You see it in TV and film, we've just completely normalised food waste. We always see food being just scraped into the bin, thrown around. I just think we've got a culture-wide challenge to just sort of create a new norm and a new narrative. I think sharing can help with the cost of living crisis, back to your original question, because it reduces the cost of everything, right? If I can If you're no longer buying everything brand new, but you're picking up stuff that your neighbour is giving away for free because they're just decluttering and they don't want it, you can save an awful lot of money. And we have so many students who pretty much live off OLIO. They get, it really supplements them through their education because they can get access to loads of food. And also we have people who, when they're starting out with their first flats, they kind of furnish pretty much their whole entire flat through the non-food section of OLIO. The cost of living crisis has actually accelerated the adoption and the uptake of OLIO in a way that concerns about the climate crisis has not. And also the cost of living crisis has galvanised or has inspired more businesses to redistribute their surplus food much more than the climate crisis has.
That's really interesting because I feel like with a lot of it takes a lot of time to go to the charity shops and kind of parse through it. So I love what you guys are doing of making it all almost in one place. And even going through like Vinted and things like that takes time. It's like that time poverty as well, and not only financial poverty, but that like inner balance.
I've got two questions. Just wanted to understand, in terms of your business, you're asking people to give away food and items, but how do you generate revenue from that? And the second is, if you have like a wish list of what would help you get exponential growth in different communities that you support, what would that look like?
So to answer your first question, we generate revenues by charging businesses for the service we provide. So at the moment they pay a waste contractor, take food off to waste streams. Instead they pay us. They pay us between £300 and £3,000 per location per year and we deliver a service that provides them with a zero food waste location. We give them back their impact reports, etc. And it helps improve employee retention and morale. It's also very powerful with customers. So 80% of the OLIO community say that they're more likely to shop with a particular business if they're redistributing their surplus via OLIO, for example. So there's a solid commercial business case for working with us, and that's where we generate the lion's share of our revenues. We generate a far smaller amount of our revenues through in-app advertising, and then also a freemium model where you can upgrade essentially to have an ad-free version and have a couple of other features as well. And then in terms of if I could wave a magic wand, the magic wand that I want to wave most right now is the mandatory food waste reporting regulation, because that will just be totally game changing in terms of businesses adopting to working with OLIO. And a lot of businesses have recognised that food waste is high up the list of concerns of their customers, who recognise they're wasting a lot of food in the home and kind of wish they weren't but don't know what to do about it. But the businesses to date have felt that they can't help customers stop wasting food in the home until they feel like they can't preach until they've put their own house in order. So we've all got to help businesses put their house in order so that we can then collectively, OLIO plus businesses, together co-market to end customers to give them all the tips, tricks and tools that they need to reduce food waste in the home.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Really enjoyed this session. OLIO has built an impressive community of people who believe in the purpose and mission of food sharing rather than food wasting. I'm interested to know how you went about building your community of volunteers, the 100,000 volunteers. How did you go about building it, and what's in for that?
So the first thing that we did, honestly, is we asked people for help. And that is just, it sounds blatantly obvious, but it's something that many businesses don't do. They feel like they've got to have all the answers themselves, and they feel like they've got to build everything themselves. So we ask for help at every stage of the user journey. Now, in the very earliest of days, myself and Sasha must have sort of phoned up, I don't know, like 200 people and had conversations with them to understand how they could help OLIO. Because they'd reached out and said, oh, I'd like to help OLIO, but we didn't know what help OLIO could look like. And through having conversations with them, we figured out there's kind of two main ways in which people can help OLIO. So one, they can become what is now we call an ambassador. And so we put them sort of on a digital pathway where we send them lots of content and information and materials for them to sort of spread the word about OLIO on our behalf in their communities. And then they can also either download, or we will mail to them physical marketing pack, so posters and letters and flyers for them to distribute in their local communities. And we have about 50,000 brand ambassadors. And then the volunteers who collect and redistribute surplus food, again, we ask for them to volunteer at repeated points in the user journey. And lots of volunteers come to us through word of mouth, through speaking to other volunteers, say, this is amazing, you should do it. Why do those volunteers do it? They do it for several reasons. So first of all, kind of you only have to go and rescue a whole load of food and see it and realise, oh my goodness, it wasn't for me, all of that would end up in the bin. So you immediately feel like an absolute hero. You're then in your local community giving out all this food for free that half an hour had a price tag on it, and you do it from the community of your own home. People love you because you're giving away free food. Like the inner student has never died in anyone ever. Everybody wants free food. So, and people make lifelong friendships. As I say, they do it from the convenience of their own home, they do it into their local community. And if they would like, we allow volunteers to keep up to 10% of what they collect as a thank you. And for some of our volunteers, that's a really important part of the volunteering experience, the fact that they get to keep sort of 10% of the food. For others, that's not at all important. Like, there's only so many pret-a-manger sandwiches any one person can eat, or tiger batons, and they never touch the stuff, and they just get enormous fulfillment from the process of sharing. And we celebrate our volunteers and we thank them, and we have a very open relationship with our community. Now, having our community is a fabulous asset. It's an incredible thing, right? So we have about 70,000 people joining OLIO every month. 60% of them are coming to us through word of mouth, and all the rest are through organic channels. So that's absolutely fantastic. You know, our star ratings, our net promoter score, all of those are crazy high. So that's all the positive. The challenge is that having a community that engaged means they feel like they OLIO. They are my most challenging stakeholder group. Like, they're more challenging than the media, they're more challenging than investors, they're more challenging than employees, because they actually spend an enormous amount of their time on OLIO, and they're very demanding of us, and they really hold our feet to the fire. So the most emotionally difficult times I've had on the OLIO journey, other than fundraising, has been in very heated, difficult conversations with our community, who only ever see sort of part of everything that we're dealing with, and they can get furious at us at times. So it is a double-edged sword, having a community-driven business.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Any more for any more? No. Well, thank you very much indeed again, Tessa.
No worries, thank you.
Give you a last round of applause.